Shalom and welcome to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. This is a recording of one of our 2020 Elul study classes.
I am very, very pleased and really actually excited to be beginning this series with Israel story, with Mishy and with Yochai. I'll give you a little bit of a background on how I even know who these people are. When I was getting my master's in education, I was part of a program called the I Center, and I was getting what they called a master's concentration in Israel education. And so I would go to Chicago 3 times, and Israel story came, and it was the first time I'd ever heard of the podcast. And I was really taken by the idea of this way of storytelling. And so I'm going to let them tell you a little bit about what Israel story is actually all about. But I just wanted to share them with all of you and to be able to say that I think this is a really powerful way of beginning our journey towards the high holidays, towards the Yamim Noraim, because really what we are trying to figure out in the next 7 weeks is what it means to tell our story, what it means for us to have a story of our lives, of this past year, of the story we want to tell for the next year, and how we need to be part of that work to make that story something that allows us to go through Tshuvah and be able to say those sorries and also be the person that we hope to be. So I'm going to turn it over, and as soon as they explain a little bit about Israel's story, I'll ask our first question, and then, as they said a few moments ago, you're welcome to ask questions in the chat. There will also be some time if you would like to ask questions in between or at the end. Feel free to raise your hand, and if you're not on camera, to virtually raise your hand or just write your question in the chat. And without further ado, Bechavod, Yochai, and Mishy, so nice to have you.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here, and lovely to virtually meet all of you. So my name is Mishy Harman, and that is Yochai Maital.
Hi.
Yochai is currently in Tel Aviv. I'm currently in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I imagine many of you are in LA, perhaps not all of you though, but many of you. We are the founders and creators of Israel Story. And Israel Story is Israel's leading podcast. We are often referred to as the Israeli This American Life. And we are also, to our delight, the largest Jewish podcast in the world. We have now hundreds of thousands of listeners in more than 190 countries around the world. And what we essentially do, and we'll get into sort of why we do this and how this came to be. But what we essentially do is we try to tell a story of a different kind of Israel, a more nuanced one, one that doesn't fall into sort of these flat, grand narratives that govern so much of our thoughts and discussions about Israel, political narratives, religious narratives, BDS narratives, Israel advocacy narratives, but rather tries to recognize and celebrate the tremendous human tapestry, the sort of richness of traditions, cultures in Israel. And we do so by telling stories of everyday Israelis of all shapes and colors and kinds, Jews and Muslims and Christians and Palestinians and Israelis and foreign workers and Russian immigrants and Ethiopian Jews and Mizrahim and Ashkenazim and left-wingers and right-wingers, and try to tell stories that humanize people, basically, and by doing so, try to expand these circles of engagement with Israel, not necessarily support for Israel, but engagement with Israel, to people who are otherwise perhaps find it difficult to really become very interested in the show. And I'll just say, lastly, before Yochai weighs in and maybe we get into some of the sort of the history of this show and what we do and why we do it, I'll just say that early on, given that you're in LA, primarily LA-based crowd, early on when we created Israel Story, so we created Israel Story first in Hebrew, and we were one of the very first podcasts in Israel. In fact, we formed the Israeli Podcasting Association and convened its inaugural meeting in my living room, and I think there were 5 or 6 people there. Today there are many more Israeli podcasters. It still is not the sort of cultural phenomenon that it is in the States, but there are definitely many, many more podcasts. And we started this with very, very little experience or really no experience whatsoever. And before long, through a series of events, which if you're interested and we can get into later, we became a national radio show. And then we made a somewhat counterintuitive decision, which was to create an English version of this show. And it was counterintuitive because we were now essentially trying to create the American version of the Israeli version of This American Life. And in doing so, I often thought of my college roommate, Jesse, who is from LA, from Santa Monica. And Jesse comes from a sort of Jewish family. His father is Jewish, his mother is not. He would probably say on the census that he is Jewish, but other than some sort of nominal bar mitzvah, does not really incorporate any real Jewish rituals, at least in his life. And unlike his grandfather, who was a Holocaust survivor and had a little tzedakah box where he would put a dime or a nickel every Friday to, plant trees in Israel or something like that. And even his father, who was a teenager during the 6-Day War and came and volunteered on a kibbutz following 1967, Jesse doesn't really have any kind of emotional connection to Israel. And for him, Israel, like for many people, I'm sure many people Israel is primarily New York Times headlines and news about Bibi, about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, about the occupation, about Iranian bombs. And for Jesse, who is otherwise extremely progressive and was involved in both Obama campaigns and so on and so forth, it became increasingly difficult to reconcile any interest in Israel. Again, not support for, but any real interest in Israel with his otherwise progressive worldview. And in thinking about Israel's story, we said, well, we want to create a narrative about Israel which allows the Jessies of the world to re-engage. We want them to, if we can tell stories that are interesting enough for the Jessies of the world, it would be almost irrelevant that they're coming from Israel. They might as well be coming from Venezuela or from India or from Iceland. But of course, for us as Israelis, there's nothing at all coincidental about the fact that they are coming from Israel. And we thought that that would be a way for us to expand circles of engagement with Israel. So that is what we set out to do. And to our delight, we're now entering our 10th year of working on this project. And have released 4 full seasons in Hebrew, and we're now in the midst of our 5th season in English. So that's sort of a very general overview. Yochai, I don't know if you want to add to that.
I mean, the only thing I want to add is you sort of talked about the Jessies of the world, and it is pretty amazing that here we are about maybe 8 years since we started this sort of story odyssey. And we do have hundreds of thousands of listeners, literally from all over the world, and people write us from all kinds of interesting corners, and it's very exciting. But for me, at least, there's also an element in this whole project of really of self-discovery in a way. I mean, I come from Tel Aviv. I love Tel Aviv. I'm a proud Tel Avivian. But often Tel Aviv gets criticized for being a bubble, and I think that's true. But it's true for most of our lives. We like to encapsulate ourselves in little bubbles of people that we know that usually have similar opinions to us and have been raised similarly, and we just feel more comfortable in that bubble. And I'm no different in that. And when we started this Israel story and this whole journey, it really enabled me to meet in Israel that I've never met before and leave my bubble in radical ways and really not just, I mean, because I knew Israel well before geographically in terms of, where all the, best little hidden springs are, etc. But in terms of really getting into all these different corners and meeting people that have very, very different life stories and views and values, and trying to piece together some kind of a version of what this country is about, really, because our name is Israel Story, and it's actually kind of weird because there is no Israel story really. It's just an amalgam of all I don't know if that's a word, amalgam of all these amalgamation. I don't know, of all these people's lives that together somehow we're struggling to sort of make a story together, and so that there's a lot of that in this process for me personally.
Right. I very much identify with what you just said, Yochai, and I'll just add that, Israel is an extremely fragmented society, so I'm from Jerusalem, and if you take Jerusalem as an example, Jerusalem has about 900,000 residents. About a third of them are ultra-Orthodox Jews, and about a third of them are Arabs. But growing up in Jerusalem, even though you see members of these other groups almost on a daily basis on the line for, at the medical clinic or in the shuk or in the supermarket or in the driver's ed course or whatever it is, to be completely honest with you, I never actually had any social interactions or any friends I didn't have any friends who were ultra-Orthodox or Arab, and in that I don't think that my story is at all unique. I think that this is basically the default situation for most Israelis. That, as Yochai said, we surround ourselves with like-minded people who went to the same schools and prayed at the same shuls, or parents have similar professions or are members of the similar socioeconomic groups. And what happens, and in that, of course, Israel I don't think is unique. I think that this is unfortunately something that happens around the world. I know that so many of my American friends were so shocked by the outcome of the 2016 election because they literally didn't know anybody who voted for Trump. And yet nearly half of America, not quite, but nearly half of America voted for Trump. So I don't think that this is a uniquely Israeli phenomenon, but perhaps what is unique about Israel and
the thing is that in America you have all these great expanses, so it's easier for people to be disconnected from each other. In Israel, we're a tiny country. We're all living in the same cities, stuck in each other's lives. So it's hard to imagine that it is actually, in a way, it is sort of segregated or divided into groups.
Right, and what happens more often than not is that you'll see somebody walking on the street, and you'll immediately take in what they have or don't have on their head, or what color skin they have, or what clothes they're wearing, and you'll put them in some sort of a box. You'll put some sort of label on them, and then you'll start piling up all these assumptions that you have based on other members of that group. So you think you'll know what their dinner table looks like, and what newspapers they read, and what they think about the Gay Pride Parade in Jerusalem, and what they did or didn't do in the army, and so on and so forth. And I think it's true for both of us that if we've discovered one thing while working on this project is it's how rarely people actually conform to those stereotypes. And we thought that when you pile up all these assumptions onto people, within a split second, you feel that you know so much about them that it almost obviates the need to actually talk to them, because what are you likely to discover? You'll just confirm what you already know. And as I said, we've discovered in stepping out of our own little bubbles how wrong we were to assume that, and we thought that actually a podcast was an extremely powerful medium through which to try to combat that tendency of ours, because so much of this judging is based on visual input. We see someone and we immediately sort of categorize them. And we thought that, yes, like it's true that
curly hair, glasses, must be some kind of an intellectual Jewy type. Am I right?
Well, stereotypes always lie.
Do I have you pegged?
So we thought that if it's true that there are accents and phrases and idioms that people use, but we thought that if we were able to eliminate the visual part of this process and really just present people with a voice, perhaps they would be able for a little bit longer, maybe only a minute or two, but a little bit longer, to suspend their judgment and actually listen to the story of somebody who lives a very different life than they do. And that thankfully was exactly what the reaction to the show was when we initially started. People said again and again, the sort of most common response that we got once people started listening to us was, my name's Itzik, I'm 55 years old from Yokneam, and last night while walking the dog or doing the dishes or going out for a walk or whatever was the first time that I actually listened to the story of, and then insert some sort of minority demographic, ultra-Orthodox woman from Tzfat, or a Bedouin teenager from Hura, or a Eritrean refugee living in South Tel Aviv.
So it's so powerful to hear how you're telling a story, because as you mentioned at the beginning, you have to decide how to tell a story. You could tell it from many different angles. You don't have to just tell the one version. You could tell a story from this person's perspective or this person's perspective, and then it's a completely different story because you're not getting the whole version. You're just getting one piece of it. And it makes me think of our own Torah, because that's how we get drashot. We figure out what angle of that story we want to expound upon, we want to tell. So I would love to hear how you both and how Israel's story as a whole makes it such that you are teaching, but also sharing the art of storytelling, and how we as consumers, as listeners, can figure out how that can shape the way that we then tell stories.
So, it's a fascinating question, what you're asking, and we can take it in many different directions. But one thing I would like to point out is, often we'll do like workshops or do things with schools and things like that, and we'll talk about storytelling and how you tell a good story, et cetera, or talk about interviewing techniques, and people want to know how do you prepare for an interview and ask questions, et cetera, et cetera. But the truth is, to be a good storyteller, I think one of the prerequisites or one of the things you need to really practice is to be a good listener, a good story listener. So really, in a way, one of the things that, we're not the first or last. Storytelling is, we have no, we have, 1 second, sorry. We have no monopoly on storytelling or anything like that. Obviously, I'm sorry, this is my son bothering you, even though he was threatened not to bother me. Sorry about that. Sorry about that. I think that listening is really important. Now, in Israel, just to give you a little example here of what radio sort of sounds like in Israel. Basically, people are very combative. Like on the radio, the different radio DJs and journalists, they sort of try and, it's almost like they go into battle with you when they interview, and they're trying to beat you into submission or something like that. So just this is a little snippet of sort of what radio sounds like in Israel, in case some of you have never had the privilege of hearing it.
לא ענית על שאלה אחת, ינון מגל, תודה רבה לך. כן, לא, אתה.
מה ההבדל בינך לבין היטלר, כלב אדום שכמוך?
אז תלך קיבינימט לארצות הברית, אתה והחברים שלך, פשטינקן הדרג גייב קיבינימטי, תעביר אותו מפה, לך לעזאזל.
That's one of the things that we came with a very different attitude, and we wanted to change that. We wanted to really create a space where people can tell their story, feel comfortable with us. So we would, go back to people often. We would go usually to their house or to whichever space they felt more comfortable with, and really trying to listen to people. So that's one thing I wanted to say that's really important. And this process of telling stories is actually just knowing how to listen and practicing that.
I'll just add to that.
Yeah.
So, sorry. Go.
No, I was just going to say, before you respond, I think it's such a powerful way of thinking of Elul, because that's exactly what we're supposed to be doing. We're supposed to be kind of taking stock and listening to ourselves as to what it is that is going to be the story, the work that we need to do. So I just wanted to point out that you really hit that nail on the head, even if it's two completely different things that we're talking about here. That is exactly what this cheshbon nefesh is supposed to be for us, this accounting of our soul. Though we don't talk about it as listening, that's exactly what we're supposed to be doing. We're supposed to meditate and be introspective and really figure out what it is that we need to hear to then be able to act upon. So thank you for sharing that answer.
Sure.
So I think that that in our previous answer, we both spotlighted what we had gotten out of this, which was stepping out of our own little communities and getting to know Israel and so on and so forth. But perhaps it's also in light of your question, Rabbi, it's interesting to talk for a second about the process for the people telling their stories. And we decided to call our show Israel Story, which was a pretty presumptuous name. And early on, we had a serious problem, which was that though we said that we were here to tell a story of a different, more nuanced Israel, really our reach was limited. We were four friends, Yochai, myself, and two other good friends. Perhaps this is a good moment to say that we had all grown up together in the conservative youth movement, Noam, in Israel, and we'd all been friends since third grade, I believe, Yochai. And had remained friends, and each went in different paths, but got back together in our late 20s to embark on this project together. And in many ways, we were a terrible team to achieve. We weren't well positioned to achieve our goal because we essentially couldn't have been more similar to each other if we tried. We were all boys. We were all friends. We were all born in 1983, with the exception of Yochai, who was born in December 82. So he was our diversity ticket. We were all living in Jerusalem or Tel Aviv. All had parents who had spent a lot of time in the States or were themselves olim. In the academic world and so on and so forth. We were all very, very similar. So it was very difficult for us to claim that we represented some sort of variety of Israeli experiences, or really that we had access to a variety of Israeli experiences. So early on, we tried to think of ways in which we could step out of our little social bubbles and tell stories that were more reflective of Israeli society as a whole. And it wasn't easy. I mean, when we first began, no one even knew what a podcast was. No one knew what we wanted from them. So now it's much easier and to get people to talk to us. But it wasn't so simple. And we tried to come up with ideas of projects that would allow us to really explore different sides of Israeli society. One of the earliest projects that we came up with was called Herzl 48. So Herzl Street is the most common street name in all of Israel. There are, I believe, 53 or something, 54 Herzl streets throughout Israel, sort of the Israeli equivalent of Main Street. And we chose number 48 because of the year of the establishment of the state. And we said, you know what, there's something relatively arbitrary about one's address. So why don't we go and knock on every single 48 Herzl street from the north till the south? The northern one was, the most northern one was in Kiryat Shmona, and the most southern one was, I believe, in Dimona. Eilat has a Herzl street, but not a number 48. And we knocked on doors there. And, you know, when you go embark on a project like this, and you speak to everyone who happens to live or work at a Herzl 48, you reach young people and old people and rich people and poor people and right-wingers and left-wingers and religious and secular and so on and so forth. We were slightly concerned that we wouldn't meet many Arabs because, you know, Al-Fahim doesn't have a Herzl street. But in Zichron Yaakov, Herzl 48 is a pharmacy. So, and like 90% of pharmacists in Israel are Arabs. So that's where we met Muhammad, the pharmacist. So we even met Arabs on this adventure of ours. And I tell you all of this because to give you a little taste of what the experience is like for someone to tell their own story. So remember, we don't usually talk to people who are used to being profiled in the media. We talk to everyday men and women. And for I would say the majority of them, this is the first and perhaps only time in their lives that anyone from the media has ever expressed any interest in them. And in fact, for many of them, they tell us it's the only time that really people outside of their family have expressed interest, and sometimes even in their family. And we sit with people for hours and hours and hours and ask them stories about their lives. And of course, there's a whole side of this, which is gaining people's trust and allowing them to open up at the sort of pace that feels comfortable to them, because you can't just go into someone's house and a stranger's house and immediately ask them to, you know, recount their most joyous or painful moments of life. But I just wanted to share one anecdote, which I think will perhaps give you a little sense as to your question, Rabbi, which was that in Kiryat Shmona we met a woman called Sima Mutai who lived at Herzl 48, and we knocked on her door and asked her if we explained the project and asked her if we could come in, and she was extremely nice and invited us into her living room and gave us some lemonade with mint and some nut cake, and we sat and we were talking and we were asking questions about Herzl Street and Kiryat Shmona, about her life. And we sort of have this motto that everyone has a story to tell, that if you just spend enough time with somebody, everyone has something interesting to share. And Sima Mutai was the first person we met who seriously challenged that motto. Because she was deathly boring. We were sitting there for hours and hours and hours asking her, and her answers really were one snoozer after another. And we were looking at each other and saying, well, maybe we need to revise our motto. Maybe everyone has a story to tell, but Sima Mutai. Maybe 3 hours into our time with her, we were really sort of grasping at straws, trying to ask any random question we could think of. And maybe 3 hours into our time with her, she got a phone call and took it in the other room. And I could overhear the phone call. And when she came back, we said, oh, who was it? And she said, it was my son. It's his birthday next week. So I said, oh, wonderful. How old is he going to be? And she said, whatever, 32 or I can't remember. And I sort of quickly calculated in my mind. And I said, oh, so he was born in, June 1982 or something like that. And she said, it's an interesting thing. My son was born at 5 a.m. on June 7th, 1982. And at 7 a.m., 2 hours later, my brother was killed in the first war in Lebanon. And I named my son after my brother. And my mother, meaning this baby's grandmother, his entire life couldn't call the little child by his name because she felt that this little baby was a replacement for her dead son. And that was a pretty amazing story. And it was, what was most amazing about this to me was the fact that it didn't dawn on her that this was even in any way a story worth sharing or unique. It was just her life. And it just took a tremendous amount of time and patience for this to come up. And it could have just as easily not have come up. Mm-hmm. So I think that the experience of telling your story is also an experience of just sort of realizing that your life is meaningful. Your life is full of these unique perspectives and experiences that make you who you are, and that a lot of them are extremely valuable and worth sharing. So I think that there's a lot of value for the person telling a story as well.
That actually connects. Renee sent me a question. I think it's privately, so I'll share it with everybody. Is that she asks, or he asks, I'm sorry, I'm not sure. Was there any common theme in all of the people you interviewed? So my first reaction was to say, no, not really. But now that I'm listening to you talk, Mishy, I think there is the one common thing is that they all have stories, and all of our interviewees' stories play an important role in how they form their own identity. And people have very, very different attitudes towards their stories. Some are very proud and they just want to share it. Some are ashamed of their stories and share them reluctantly, or some don't even realize they have a story. Maybe I just wanted to, Misha, did I cut you off? I'm sorry if I cut you off.
No.
But I wanted to share just also an answer to your question, Rabbi, about sort of the roles that story play in this process of understanding ourselves and Tshuvah. It just sort of made me think of a story that I'm actually working on now. I'm not going to tell the whole story. It's for the next season. So I hope you guys will all maybe take this opportunity to invite all of you, by the way, to look us up, Israel Story, israelstory.org on our website. Or if you guys are podcast listeners, you can, of course, search for us wherever you listen to podcasts. Search for Israel Story. That's singular. And of course, Facebook, Instagram. And one of the stories that we're working on this 5th season that will be coming up is a story about the first battle of in the southern Golan of the Yom Kippur War, or one of the first battles. There were a bunch of battles that opened simultaneously. And it's a story that's not often told because we didn't win that battle. Usually the battles that we tell about are more the battles that end up victorious. But this story really caught me because it turns out that battles that are not victorious often have equal amount, if not more, of bravery and heroism involved. And specifically, I interviewed a lot of characters that were stuck in this one bunker for 3 days in enemy territory in the Golan and really went through some horrific things. And after the battle, they sort of the group dispersed and didn't stay in touch, which is quite amazing. You know, Israel is such a close-knit society, and as people tend to stay in touch, especially with their army mates, they all dispersed. And they all sort of carried the story inside of them, but never talked about it. And Menachem, who is the commander of this group of paratroopers stuck on the hill, he was also he's this sort of macho Israeli guy, completely repressing all these horrific things and his soldiers dying and things that he saw, until one day he had a mental breakdown, he was on a date night with his wife and they watched a movie. It was like some war movie about a plane crash in Iraq, an American movie, a Hollywood movie. And on the way back, his wife just sort of innocently asked him, Menachem, didn't that movie, bring you back to those days in the war? And then, actually, I think I might have a clip of it. So I'll just let you guys hear a little bit of Menachem, because he's the person in my ears lately, and really I find him very inspiring, and also help me make the points about your question, Rabbi. So this is, I think, Menachem describing his breakdown after his wife asked him that question.
I just broke into a cry, and it was loud. It was bizarre to me because I haven't heard my cry a quarter of a decade ago. I never cried since then. I didn't recognize the voice, the sound of a cry, of my cry, and I couldn't see the road because of my tears. And then I had to stop. One
thing you have to understand about Menachem that I find fascinating is that his repression of the incidents that happened to him, etc. It wasn't coincidental. He grew up second generation to Holocaust survivors. So his parents never spoke about the Holocaust at all. Only much later in life did they speak about it, and even then they would not talk to Menachem about it. They only took to talk to the grandchildren. It sort of skipped a generation. So basically, Menachem, he grew up with the value of repressing, almost indebted in him. He has a little clip here that he kind of talks about actually exactly that. So these are the values that Menachem was raised on, according to Menachem.
And I was raised, if I will describe it, that the world wake up in the morning, brush its teeth, and think how it can destroy our family life. That was as simple as that, because they experience it, and after this battle, I experienced it as well.
And so, after following that breakdown, Menachem finally realized that he needed to get some treatment, and he actually did start talking very hesitantly and reluctantly. He went and talked to a therapist who happened to be a female therapist who was much younger than him. And this is a little clip of him talking about sort of some things that he discovered in that process of taking himself through therapy.
It was both shame and a little bit frightening. And I had to rebuild and restructure everything that I know about myself. And I discovered a very important thing along this way. I began to realize that indeed talks can change. Even today it sounds strange to me, but I know that it works.
All of a sudden he discovered that actually talking can create some kind of change. He was as a sort of very pragmatic macho Israeli. He's like, don't talk so much, just do. But all of a sudden he realized that no, actually telling my story and talking about it and sharing my experience has a profound impact. And later on, he shared his own experience of going to therapy with his other soldiers, which helped them go to therapy and improve their lives a lot, because many of them were suffering from PTSD, and that affected their marriage life and their parenting and really everything to this day with many of them. So that just, I'm bringing this example to answer your question, Rabbi, because there's also a certain power to telling your story. Telling your story isn't just understanding your identity or something like that. It's also a way of shaping it and changing it.
Yeah.
So in the case of Menachem, there are a lot of things that he actually regrets from that battle. And a lot, there's also something called survivor's guilt, which I won't get into here. But one of his ways of changing that or affecting that is actually telling his story. And I'm happy that we have sort of the right and the privilege to help in that, in our little way.
Sorry, I didn't mean to spotlight myself before you were done.
Yeah.
Mishy, maybe you will, in a second, I want to respond to what Yochai just said, but maybe you'll answer Jennifer's question, which was if there was any interview that really knocked the wind out of you. And you can interpret that any way you wish. I just want to say that in listening to the interview that you just shared with us, it actually made me think a lot about what the shofar is supposed to do for us. This idea of that crying, the 3 different sounds that are supposed to sound like these different cries, and how every year they might sound different to us based on our own emotional state and what we need to be hearing. And I think that power of telling your story, and whether that's to a therapist or just writing it down in your own journal or speaking to someone who's interviewing you, in the case of Israel's story, that talking about it makes you even think about it differently, and makes you think about how it's possible that the story you've even been telling yourself is actually different than the way that you experienced it, and that you're suppressing something, or that you're over-exaggerating something, depending on what it is, and the way
Absolutely.
that you're telling that story.
Apropos this battle, one of the amazing things is that I talked to many of the soldiers and sort of the survivors, the warriors that were there, and sometimes it's as if they're describing a different battle. They each have a very, very different experience, and even sometimes the facts are different. They're all trying to recount their experiences as truthfully as possible, yet they're telling different stories because they're different people so they experience it very differently.
And that's what's so powerful about Tshuvah, because you might be saying sorry to someone else who is either unaware that you think that you even did anything to hurt them, or on the flip side, you might say sorry for something and they might say, that's not what you should be sorry for. This other thing is what you should really be sorry for. So this idea of Tshuvah being something that you have to do to a person rather than, via Facebook or in a text message or something, really allows that conversation to come out, so that the story is then aligned and you're telling the same story of how you can repair that relationship, yourself, whatever the Tshuvah is for. Which is I've never thought of Tshuvah this way in my life, and just thinking about how your podcast is created and how it opens people up is really a powerful way of thinking through our own recognition of how we should ask ourselves these same questions and tell our stories, and then be able to act on them. So Mishy, why don't you answer that story from Jennifer, and then if anybody else has any other questions, we have a question from
Vivian as well, so you can also address that. Address that as well, Mishy.
Sure. So to answer Vivian's question, we have a show in Hebrew and a show in English, and most of the content is not overlapping. So there's stories that we do in Hebrew, stories that we do in English. It does, to a certain extent, limit who we're able to interview, although, first of all, many Israelis speak English, and second, if they really don't speak English or don't feel comfortable expressing themselves in English, we will often interview them in Hebrew and either dub or use some other sort of device to tell their story. So maybe on the margins, it a little bit sort of limits who we're able to interview, but not in any kind of significant way. As to Jennifer's question, we've interviewed, I would estimate, thousands of people by this point over the years, many of whom have stayed with me and some of whom have become close friends. Our process is such that we spend so much time with people. We will often go back time and again to interview them and spend, months and in some extreme cases even years following their stories. That you really feel as if you expand your circle of friends and family members, and so many of them have been really people that I would never otherwise have encountered or met, and introduced me very generously to their lives. And we often say that our microphone is almost like a magic wand, because it sort of gains us access into the living rooms and kitchens and bedrooms of people who otherwise are just, we would never talk to. But I don't want to give you a cop-out answer, Jennifer, so I will actually answer your question. Of course, I could answer this in a million different ways and choose different examples. However, I will choose one example.
Can I guess?
Yeah.
Your mother?
No.
I tried.
So
she's one of my favorite interviews. I love when Dorothy's on the show.
She's definitely a character. So I have lived my entire life essentially fulfilling most expectations that my parents have had of me. I did, by and large, what they hoped I would do. I went to the schools they hoped I would go to. I followed, with the exception of entering radio, which my mom always says, Barbie Heller says, "Can you make a living out of that?"
A wrong turn down the road somewhere.
Right. But by and large, I've really been a pretty dutiful son. The one real exception to that was my choice of a spouse. I returned to Israel after 7 years abroad to settle down and meet a nice Jewish girl in Jerusalem and settle down. And shortly after returning to Jerusalem, I met Federica, who is a Catholic, Italian Catholic journalist. And we fell in love, and she is my wife, and soon also going to be the mother of our child. And that was extremely, extremely difficult for my parents and extremely difficult for me. I grew up, as I said, in a conservative home. We're fairly traditional. This was not in any game plan that anyone, including myself, ever had. And yet this happened, and all is fine. And my parents love Federica, and so on and so forth. But I mention all of this to say that right around the time that Federica and I were trying to decide, each one of us separately and both of us together, whether we wanted to actually get married, I happened to go interview an ultra-Orthodox couple in Jerusalem. They are originally from Bnei Brak. They come from relatively aristocratic Haredi families. And they met in shidduch in the lobby of a hotel, and the whole thing, right? Got married after 5 dates, I believe, and lived a very, very typical Haredi life. Bunch of kids, 4 or 5 kids, I can't remember anymore. He was some sort of star student at the Kollel, and then he lost his faith, and he at first hid this fact, and he would pretend that he was still going to the kollel every day, but in fact he would have a separate change of clothes and would go see movies, sort of daytime movies in Tel Aviv, and he lived this sort of double life for several years till his wife found out. And then they were on the verge of getting divorced. I'm not going to go into all the details of the story. You can listen to it. It's in an episode called Losing My Religion. They were on the verge of getting divorced, and ultimately decided, as they were negotiating the terms of their separation, they decided to stay together. And they now live in an ultra-Orthodox neighborhood in Jerusalem. She is completely ultra-Orthodox, and he is completely secular.
Wow.
She goes to her rabbis with questions which the rabbis could never imagine, such as, my husband eats shrimps and then wants to kiss. Am I allowed to kiss him? And sitting with them, and I've sat with them multiple times, and seeing the kind of home that they have created, which is really, it's in many, many ways, it's much, much more difficult than what I was attempting to create, was an inspiration for me that what was the answer about the shrimps? I think that, yes, I think that if a certain amount of time passes, and because there's only like little specks of shrimp that maybe are in between his teeth or something, I think the rabbi said it was okay.
It's fine. Yeah.
Anyway, it was a real inspiration.
Rabbi Schatz is giving her hechsher here. So.
Yeah.
There you go.
Go ahead, everybody.
Yeah. The end.
I just wanted to answer quickly René's question about in the course of interviewing, if we discover somebody's in need of talking to a professional, do we suggest it? That's actually, I'll just answer this briefly. It is something that happened to us a few times, where we interviewed somebody, and often it'll be the case that the story will actually sound fantastic, but listening back to it, we'll have questions about whether this person is sane and stable. And ultimately, we're very careful. Generally, we try not to air stories of people who are not sure that they are, really have, the capacity that they're actually with it. But I don't think usually it's not our place to suggest that they undergo therapy or not, or unless it's, I don't know, some kind of extreme situation where we're afraid that they're going to hurt themselves. But another interesting sort of aspect of an answer to your question, René, is that Mishy also said that he went back and interviewed this couple a few times, and I'm sure you're still in touch with them, right, Mish? So because of the nature of our interviews and how we conduct them, we often sort of become friends with the people we interview, and then the relationship enters into sort of a different realm where we actually do stay in touch later on, and sometimes, help out with things or give advice and things like that. So the lines are not so clear always.
And Yochai, I would say that you actually do sometimes act as a therapist to some of your subjects.
Well, I think we all do. I think the act of telling your story, it's very similar. There are definitely similarities between a radio reporter and a therapist. But our client is the listener. That's the difference, I guess.
I don't know if either of you have received any questions privately. I'm not seeing any other public questions. I want to ask you one. I know it's 11:59 and different times where the two of you are, but that's what time it is here.
Thank you, Robin, by the way. Robin is, yeah.
Yeah. It is a wonderful podcast. It's true. I wouldn't have brought a bad podcast. So everyone should listen to Israel's Story. It's a great podcast. So I want to ask one final question, and feel free to think about this for a second. You don't have to answer right away. But my question is, you are the first people we're hearing from, and between now and Rosh Hashanah, we have about 6.5-ish. We have 7 weeks total between Tisha B'Av and Erev Rosh Hashanah, which, as I've talked about with my own community, it's like the spring version of the Omer. We're just counting towards something different. And I wonder if, as professional storytellers, but really professional story errors, that you can give us some advice on how we should unleash and dig deeper into our own stories. We're not each going to be able to be on the Israel Story podcast, and we're not going to each have someone interviewing us over the next 7 weeks. So what's the work that we can be doing to really dig deeply into our own stories and how we can use that as a sort of work, or if we want to call it meditation to make it not sound like work, towards the Yamim Noraim, to be able to be fully present as the person that we wish to be as the Yamim Noraim begin?
Wow. That's not an easy question, Rabbi. Mishy, do you have something? I want to really think about this. It's really an interesting question.
I put you on the spot. I'm sorry.
No, it's good. That's your job.
One of I think the most important qualities that you need to have in order to be an effective storyteller is to be curious and to be sort of develop these kind of antennae of curiosity where you see stories and just interesting aspects of life everywhere. And I once had a friend who, you spend a lot of time in the army guarding. And most people hate guarding because it's really boring. You're standing in a place and, scenery isn't changing really. And I had a friend who told me that he was never ever bored while guarding. And I asked, really, how were you never bored? And he said, well, you just think, if you look like at a single leaf or something like that, just think how many different things you can notice about the leaf. And by you just start noticing more and more about this leaf and its shape and its color and different, veins within the leaf or whatever it is. And once you start thinking like that, by the time is as one of Yochai's interviewees in the latest episode that we just released said, there isn't enough time. Time is not enough. You can never get bored. And I think that the same thing applies perhaps into some sort of introspective thinking about your own story. If you sort of are able to take nothing for granted and really just say, wow, that was such an unusual interaction, or I don't know, yesterday coming back from take my dogs out to these woods nearby, and I had like 4 or 5 different events that happened to me on this 10-minute long drive back home. Each one of them blew my mind. It was like a really interesting interaction. And then when I got home, I started telling Federica, my wife, about all of these interactions. And I ended up telling her about these interactions for much longer than they actually took in reality. But it's just a way of thinking about your own life, that everything is unique and everything is of interest. So maybe by being surprised by everything that happens to you is a good way to try to do some sort of cheshbon nefesh and really view everything almost like a child with this kind of wonder and amazement.
Yeah.
It's interesting. I mean, the other thing maybe I would say is that it could be interesting to sort of think of the stories that you tell about yourself, like when you either when you meet somebody new, or sort of the stories that you tend to come back to and keep telling about yourself. And just sort of looking at those stories and trying to understand why are those stories the ones you keep coming back to? Why are those important to you? What do they say about sort of the way you think about yourself? And are you happy with that, or would you like to introduce, some new stories maybe, or make some edits? Yeah.
That's a great way for us to close, unless anybody has any other questions that you haven't yet had the chance to write. This was such an honor. It was really wonderful to hear from both of you, to be able to kind of know the
honor was ours.
To know the background of Israel's story, which this is now the second time that I've heard a little bit more, and just really every time just brings such a different perspective to how we listen to stories, but also in these past few answers, how we can now be doing that work ourselves, and be thinking about our own stories. And I love the idea of thinking about the stories that we tell and why those are the stories that we tell over and over again. Because as I started off this whole, I was about to say podcast, it's not a podcast, but as I started off this whole experience by saying that it's so similar to our Torah, right? We read these same stories over and over and over again. And why those stories, right? Why do we read about the Akedah during Rosh Hashanah? Why do we read about Chana on Rosh Hashanah, right? What's the point of having certain stories told at certain times? So thank you so much. It was just such a pleasure to have both of you here and to be able to learn a little more. And I'm going to let you have the last word, but I just want to say to everyone, you really, really should listen to Israel's Story. It's a wonderful podcast. It's an easy podcast to listen to while doing other things. You don't have to feel like it's going to give you nightmares or that there's a better time of the day to listen to it. It's really a wonderful, wonderful thing to listen to at any point. And whichever one of you wants to have the last word, I want to let you give it. Go for it,
Yochai.
No, I mean, I think we said a lot, but we're as I said before, we really hope that you'll sort of join the Israel Story community of listeners and sign up to our podcast. And we have a sort of a closed Facebook group that you're welcome to join as well. And we'd love to, if you do end up giving us a listen, we would really love to hear from you, what you thought. As I like to say, we're always in the market for good stories. So if anybody out there has a good story, I'll put my email in here. It's Yochai at israelstory.org.
And if anyone ever needs it, I'm happy to, if you forget it or whatever, I can send it to you.
Yeah. And it was great talking to you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Yeah. Went in very different directions than sort of conversations we usually have. So that was really, you made us sweat and work for our answers here.
Great, great. Well, thank you again both for being here. Just so everyone knows, we will make sure that these are, I know some people have already left, so I'm kind of preaching to the choir, but if you are part of any of these classes and have to leave early, they will be recorded and in a Google Drive for people to be able to listen to. We actually have a TBA podcast now, and these are also going to be put on as just being able to listen to them, not just have to watch them. So thank you. Hamon Todah, really just an amazing opportunity. And thank you all for being here. And we hope to see you tomorrow. Abigail Pogrebin, who is an author, is going to be joining us at maybe also 11. I don't remember, but it's the same link, same password, 9 a.m., not 11 a.m. Thank you, Renee. And see you all soon. Laila Tov, Boker Tov, wherever you are.
Tov, yeah.
See you all soon. Bye.
Bye. Shalom.
Bye.
You have been listening to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. If you enjoy these podcasts, we invite you to write a review on the Apple Podcast site or wherever you get your podcasts. For more information about Temple Beth Am Los Angeles, go to tbala.org.